In the year 899, a boy named Wang Yan was born into privilege though not into greatness. His father, Wang Yan, was a hardened warlord who had clawed his way to power during the chaotic final days of the Tang dynasty. By 907, Wang Yan had declared himself emperor of a breakaway kingdom known as Former Shu, nestled in the fertile Sichuan Basin, a land of rivers, poets, and plenty. He ruled not with elegance but with cunning and sword. But his son was made of finer cloth, silk to be precise. When Wang Yan became crown prince, there were whispers in the court, whispers that he was more interested in poetry than politics, in theater than treaties, and in the sound of flutes more than drums of war. But Wang Yan, aging and exhausted, turned a blind eye. He renamed his son Wang Yan and prepared him for rule, hoping perhaps that leisure might finally replace bloodshed. In 918, Wang Yan died. The throne passed to the boy, now barely 20, who walked into the imperial court not like a ruler stepping into responsibility, but like an artist stepping onto a stage. And what a stage he made it. Wang Yan transformed the palace into a grand theater of decadence. The marble halls were draped in embroidered silk, and lanterns lined the courtyards like fireflies caught in cages. He brought musicians, dancers, and courtesans into court life. He composed verses under moonlight and held floating wine cup poetry games on lotus ponds. Eunuchs and noblemen performed comedy skits for his amusement. He dressed not as a sovereign but as a performer, his robes heavy with embroidery, his mood light with song. Officials found themselves bewildered. Policies were delayed while the emperor lounged behind gauze curtains, plucking zither or reciting love poems. Ministers who brought reports were dismissed with a smile or asked to read their memos in verse. Some tried to correct him. They were soon silenced, demoted, or worse, forced to perform in courtly charades for the emperor's delight. And yet, the people of Chengdu, the capital, lived well. Crops flourished. The rivers ran clean. And though the emperor played, the machinery of government stumbled forward, held together by old ministers clinging to order. But beneath the beauty of that world, beneath the scent of incense and wine, there was a growing rot. Wang Yan was not just indulgent, he was blind. Blind to the rumblings beyond the mountains. Blind to the ambitions of other kingdoms. And blind, most dangerously, to the tightening coils of fate that would one day make a mockery of his reign. For now, though, Former Shu shimmered under a golden haze of music and mist. And its emperor, young, proud, and laughing, believed it would last forever. But laughter, as history would soon show, is no shield against the sword. Inside the glittering walls of Chengdu's imperial palace, where the scent of jasmine floated through carved sandalwood corridors and silken banners rustled with every breeze, a new empire had blossomed, not one of law but of luxury. Emperor Wang Yan ruled not with decrees but with whims. His court became a stage where desire wore a crown and entertainment held a scepter. Perfumed courtiers, adorned in brocades brighter than banners, wandered aimlessly through opulent gardens, sipping wine from bowls shaped like lotuses. The palace was alive not with the sound of duty, but with laughter, music, and secrets. The emperor himself was barely ever seen in daylight. He preferred the palace at night, when candles cast shadows like dancers on the walls and flutes whispered in the darkness. He hosted nightly banquets that lasted until sunrise, lavish feasts of roasted swan, rare fruits, and imported wines. Nobles and concubines, jesters and poets, all performed in a theater of decadence for the emperor's amusement. Pleasure, not power, had become the new currency. And in the emperor's inner circle? A nest of serpents dressed in silks. The most trusted officials were no longer seasoned advisors or battle-hardened generals. They were flatterers, eunuchs, and entertainers, elevated not by merit, but by their ability to amuse. Wang Yan rewarded loyalty with lands and titles, even if that loyalty came from a court musician or a juggler who had made him laugh. Corruption flowed like wine. Ministers bribed musicians to sing praises in their favor. Laws were bent to satisfy whims. One infamous tale told of a woman who caught the emperor's eye during a lantern festival. She was married. Within days, her husband was arrested on false charges, and she was delivered to the palace, dressed in gold and tears. Even Wang Yan's favorite consort, Consort Wei, was known more for her political cunning than her beauty. She quietly pulled strings behind the scenes, arranging appointments and dismissals while maintaining the illusion of softness. Some said she ruled the empire more effectively than the emperor, but only if the empire's goals were jewels and dances, not security and legacy. Meanwhile, the common people began to murmur. Taxes grew heavier. Soldiers complained of delayed payments. Border generals sent warnings. reports of hostile movements from the later Tang dynasty to the north. But the emperor, distracted by a new theatrical troupe or the design of a lotus-shaped wine cup, ignored them all. This was a palace where laughter masked fear and perfume masked poison, where secrets moved faster than scrolls, and betrayal was as common as silk. It was beautiful, breathtaking even, but beauty, when built on neglect and lies, is as fragile as a paper lantern. And already, beyond the glitter and wine, the winds of conquest were rising. Enemies who cared nothing for poetry, only for power, were watching. And when they came, there would be no flute to charm them, no joke to deflect the blade. Just silence, and the final echoes of laughter. By the early 920s, Former Shu was no longer an empire in the traditional sense. It had become a living stage play, and Emperor Wang Yan its central performer. Each day unfolded like a scene from a farce, with ministers and generals reduced to actors, and imperial decrees twisted into props for amusement. Wang Yan didn't govern. He entertained himself. He ordered court officials to dress as clowns and perform skits mocking foreign dignitaries. He once forced a senior minister to dance in front of guests, not out of insult, but because he believed it would lighten the mood of a tense meeting. To the emperor, diplomacy was theater, and policy was a play that only mattered if it got a laugh. The throne room, once a place of ceremony and consequence, was now cluttered with musical instruments, cages of exotic birds, and painted fans. Even judicial trials became comedy routines, with verdicts sometimes based on how entertaining the accused could be. Those who begged for mercy were asked to sing their pleas. Some lived, many did not. And behind the makeup and costumes, fear crept. To laugh was to survive. Ministers rehearsed their expressions, practiced chuckles, and learned to applaud at the right moments. One misplaced grimace, one failure to appreciate the emperor's joke, could mean demotion or death. It was said that the court smelled of lavender by day and of sweat by night. What once began as artful leisure had curdled into grotesque absurdity. The empire wore a mask, smiling, painted, beautiful. But underneath, its jaw trembled. Outside the palace, the empire's defenses frayed. Border generals sent pleas for reinforcements. Armories sat neglected while funds went toward building new pleasure pavilions and importing parrots that could mimic court jokes. Soldiers drilled with rusting weapons while the emperor's entourage practiced a new comedic opera in his private theater. The people too wore their own masks. In marketplaces, they whispered about the emperor's madness, about how the empire was now ruled by jesters and wine, about how distant war drums could be heard in the night, though no official dared confirm it. And in the northern steppes, an empire was rising. The later Tang, fierce and disciplined, watched the kingdom of comedy with cold calculation. Where Former Shu bathed in laughter, the later Tang forged swords. Still Wang Yan laughed. He laughed at the generals who urged caution, laughed at astrologers who spoke of omens. He even laughed at himself, once dressing in a beggar's rags during a court masquerade, pretending to weep while collecting alms, to roaring applause. In his mind, he was the poet king, the jester emperor, the man who had turned rule into revelry. But in truth, he was no longer emperor of anything. He was a host, presiding over a party that would soon end in blood. And history, watching from the wings, was preparing to bring down the curtain. While Wang Yan composed verses under silk canopies and toasted to the moon with goblets of peach wine, a very different scene unfolded hundreds of miles to the north. There, Li Kungsu, emperor of the later Tang, was not writing poetry, he was writing campaign orders. His court was not filled with laughter, but with maps, battle drums, and strategies carved into wood with iron nails. The later Tang had been watching Former Shu for years, watching its wine-stained scrolls, its spinning dancers, its silken indifference. And now, with its defenses hollow and its leadership laughing, the moment had come. In 925, Li Kungsu sent his greatest general, Li Jiji, to lead a military campaign south. It was swift, brutal, and surgical. Armies of iron-armored cavalry swept through the mountain passes, descending on border towns like shadows. City gates that had stood for decades fell with barely a cry. Generals who should have held the front lines had long since retired to the pleasures of Chengdu, or had been replaced by court musicians turned commanders. Back in the capital, the reports began to arrive, hurried, smudged, half-believed. They told of cities lost overnight, garrisons overrun, roads choked with refugees. But Wang Yan, ever wrapped in theater, responded with disbelief. Some say he laughed at the first report, calling it a prank. Others claim he summoned his actors to perform a play about the imaginary invasion. When the panic began to spread to the nobles, the emperor called for a a distraction. While later Tang soldiers burned their way through the countryside, the imperial court held a lotus lantern festival. Dancers performed beside trembling ministers. Laughter rang out louder than fear, even as the empire burned around them. But not all could pretend. A handful of generals tried to rally a defense, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. One by one they fell, not just to steel but to the rotted foundation their emperor had built. Former Shu had become soft, a kingdom of pillows in a world of blades. By the time Wang Yan finally grasped the gravity of the invasion, it was too late. His armies were shattered, his ministers scattered, and the songs of Chengdu were being drowned out by the sound of marching boots and burning thatch. There was no last stand, no glorious battle, no final act of bravery, only a slow unraveling, like a tapestry being pulled thread by thread until it lay in ruin. As Li Jiji's army approached Chengdu, Wang Yan did not fortify the walls. He did not arm the people. He did not flee. Instead, he issued a proclamation of surrender. The court, once a theater of endless laughter, fell into silence. The stage was cleared. The audience conquered. And the emperor, who once believed the world was a poem, now stood at the edge of a history that would write his name in irony. The storm had arrived, and all the songs in the world could not stop the rain. The gates of Chengdu opened without resistance. There was no clang of swords, no final stand at the palace. Only silence. A city of silks bowed to the clang of iron-shod boots. Wang Yan, once robed in embroidered dragons and perfumed with jasmine, now stood beneath a plain canopy, surrounded not by courtiers but by conquerors. The later Tang forces, led by Li Jiji, entered the capital like a river surging through a broken dam. Palaces were seized, treasuries looted. The once proud empire of Former Shu, built by Wang Yan and squandered by his son, ceased to exist in the space of a single breath. And at the heart of this collapse stood the emperor who surrendered without a fight. But Wang Yan's humiliation was not yet complete. Stripped of titles and flanked by his family, he was forced to begin the long, degrading march north, a royal prisoner turned traveling spectacle. Gone were the jeweled robes. Gone was the poetry and pretense. He wore coarse cloth now, and his laughter, once a weapon, became a whimper. Along the route, townspeople, once subjects who had whispered his name with reverence or resentment, lined the roads to stare. Some cursed him. Some threw stones. Others simply watched, silently, as the man who had turned their empire into a stage now walked it as a clown, without a script, without applause. The emperor was not alone. His empress, consorts, brothers, sisters, even the youngest children of the royal household were made to march with him. A caravan of fallen grandeur, moving through mud and dust, no longer feared, no longer adored. Wang Yan tried at first to carry himself with dignity. He still quoted poems under his breath, still recited verses when given water, as if words might preserve some sliver of majesty. But each step, each gawk, each insult, wore him down. By the time they reached the later Tang capital of Luoyang, he was barely a man, let alone an emperor. He was brought before the court not as a ruler, but as a living warning. A cautionary tale in silk slippers, now caked in dirt. Some nobles whispered that Li Kungsu, the later Tang emperor, might spare him. That perhaps he would live out his days in quiet exile, writing sad verses, fading away in obscurity. But politics, like history, has little use for mercy. Li Kungsu's court debated Wang Yan's fate, not out of legal concern but for sport. Should a man who had ruled like a jester be executed like a criminal? Or mocked forever in captivity like the punchline of a cruel joke? In the end, the verdict was whispered like poetry. Let the actor take his final bow. Wang Yan was to be executed. Not by war, not by rebellion, but by the slow, bitter unraveling of his own farce. His march had ended, but the story had one last laugh left. The morning was grim, gray, and still. A thin mist clung to the palace grounds in Luoyang, softening the sharpness of the marble steps and muting the rustle of silk mourning robes. The former emperor of Former Shu, Wang Yan, was led from his quarters, not in chains but in quiet disgrace. His execution was not to be a spectacle. It was meant to be a conclusion. A clean break from the past. A forgotten footnote. But fate, as always, had its own script. Wang Yan, now in his late 20s but worn by shame and exhaustion, was seated with his remaining family in a garden that had once belonged to a Tang princess. He was to be executed along with his consorts, relatives, and loyal attendants, all tied to his name, all condemned by association. Some wept. Some stared into the void. One young child clutched a toy carved from the wreckage of the Shu palace. And then, it happened, the moment that would echo through history like a joke told at a funeral. A member of the later Tang Guard, trying perhaps to break the tension or simply speaking without thought, reportedly told a joke. We do not know the words, history did not preserve them. Some say it was about Wang Yan's former glory. Others claim it was about the absurdity of being a poet king undone by laughter. But what matters is this: Wang Yan laughed. Not a chuckle. Not a forced grin. A full, uncontrollable, belly-deep laughter. The kind of laugh that shakes the ribs. The kind of laugh that belongs in banquet halls, not execution yards. He laughed until he wept. His consorts looked at him in horror. One tried to hush him. A guard threatened to strike him. But Wang Yan could not stop. The laugh had become its own creature, rising from the depths of a man who had spent a lifetime drowning in pretense. In that moment he was not a prisoner. He was not a ruler. He was a boy again, laughing in the palace garden, mocking the world before it could destroy him. And then the order was given. The executioners moved swiftly. Sword met flesh. One by one his family fell. History would note their names with cold ink. But Wang Yan, the emperor who had turned his kingdom into a comedy, died with laughter on his lips. It is said that his final breath was a wheeze of amusement. That even as the blade came down, he whispered a final line of poetry, or perhaps another joke. We will never know. What we do know is that no other emperor in Chinese history died laughing. And that in the theater of empires, where tragedy and farce often blur, Wang Yan left behind the strangest legacy of all. A ruler who lived like a jest, and died like a punchline. History has a long memory, but not always a kind one. Wang Yan, the last emperor of Former Shu, was never remembered for conquest, reform, or wisdom. He left behind no great victories, no walls, no monuments. What he left instead was a riddle, a sovereign who ruled like a poet, indulged like a fool, and died, according to nearly every chronicle, laughing. For centuries, historians debated his story. Was his final laughter a sign of madness, the breakdown of a mind unfit for the world it once ruled? Or was it a last act of defiance, a performance for the ages, the emperor mocking death itself, refusing to let fear write his final line? In Confucian texts, he became a warning, the cautionary tale of excess, of indulgence without discipline, of art without leadership. Scholars painted him as a man who danced while his empire burned, who turned his court into a comedy stage while soldiers starved at the border. And yet, there is something enduring, even haunting, in his final moment. He did not beg. He did not rage. He laughed. Perhaps he realized in those last breaths that the joke had always been on him, that power is borrowed, not owned, that crowns weigh nothing in the end. Maybe his laughter was the only truth he ever told. A truth about the absurdity of kings and kingdoms. About how all men, emperor or peasant, are just brief flickers in history's endless scroll. Modern writers often look back at Wang Yan with a strange sympathy. Some call him a tragic artist in a world that demanded generals. Others see him as a mirror held up to the fragility of empires, how quickly they fall, not always by sword but by songs and soft hands. In him they find not just failure but humanness, raw, ridiculous, and real. In the great halls of Chinese history, filled with the grim portraits of conquerors and tyrants, Wang Yan's face stands out, smiling. A silk-draped ghost whispering that perhaps the true tragedy of power isn't how it ends, but how it's lived. He reminds us that not all falls are loud. Some are soft. Some wear makeup. Some end not in screams, but in laughter that no one else understands. Was it comedy? Was it collapse? Was it the last joke of a doomed king? Or was it, as some have quietly dared to believe, a moment of clarity in a life of illusion, when for once the emperor stopped pretending and simply laughed at it all? Whatever it was, the world remembered it. The emperor who died laughing.